Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I will have a conversation with my great friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everybody. Hi Aron. This is Chen. I'm a medieval historian. I'm based in Austin, Texas. Glad to be with you all today.
This is our last episode discussing David Bueller's book, Adaptive Mind. This is our second critical remarks on the book. As we mentioned in the first part of this critical remark, um, we are not so much like the criticism that we have with Bueller. A lot of times are shared with what Bueller criticizes. In a lot of ways, we are sympathetic to his criticism of evolutionary psychology, but we are not satisfied with some axioms in Bueller's criticism itself, the ways that he shares those axioms with evolutionary psychologists, and also in a lot of ways, our issues are about absences. That certain layers of analysis just are unacknowledged, not just not expansively present, but they're unacknowledged. And we think, insofar as our interest in the concept of human nature and its relationship to other transdisciplinary issues like universality and individuality goes, we don't find ultimately Bueller's book as um, comprehensively satisfying. And this is the second round of discussing why we think that and what are the layers that are absent and problematic in Bueller's work, in spite of our appreciation of his criticism of evolutionary psychology. Trent, anything to add to the introduction?
No, we should just continue our critical remarks. Yes.
Yeah. So there are four critical points that we want to talk about here. And we're going to start with the relation between evolution and history. Trent, do you want to take over that?
Yes, as a self-professed historian, I guess this is my duty. There's no way to share this burden. Okay, I think there are three things that are really intriguing during the reading process. First is evolution as historical science, because David Bueller provides something really interesting. He emphasizes that study of his species, that's a human being in particular, is what justifies this unit of analysis is a homology. It's not analogy, in the sense that historical contingency like space and time absolutely matter to determine the boundary of a species. So in the strictest sense, evolutionary biology or the evolutionary study of the human nature or humankind falls to the category of historical empiricism or science in a very broad sense. In that sense, it joins his understanding of evolution theory kind of joins a specific strand of cultural history that is the anti-social scientific model, because analogy is not important or interesting to his analysis. If there are two social animals, different species, they share very important um, features like use of certain tools or whatever. Those are interesting and could be explained perhaps through like the same evolutionary development or environment. But what really mattered for his analysis of the evolution of each individual species is the things that connect them to the ancestral like population. Is not the analogous resemblance across this. So by categorizing evolutionary theory as the historical science, he actually sides up with a certain strand of cultural history, which I find fascinating. Second is evolution theory or evolution biology for him provides explanations for history in the sense that we could explain certain cultural universals by tracing the distribution of, say, incest taboo example, like a small, perhaps genetic drift or whatever in a small group, but then account for universal. It's a matter of genealogical nexus. That's what he says. Of course, that's not the only way, but evolutionary trajectory does account for a certain amount for ecological universes for him. A third one, I think, is the most important addressing the issue here is for David Buehler, natural evolutionary history versus the cultural history. That dichotomy or the boundary is affirmed. That we can, as like Kulturwissenschaftler, we can play with the symbolic systems, but we should not expect to find anything of like law like nature or could supplement or really challenge or revise the account of a human evolution provided by evolutionary psychologists or biologists. And instead, to uncover that, we're still doing history, but we're doing natural history or evolutionary history. So even though different types of historical science are all interested in how the past influenced or conditioned the present and also shaped the future trajectories. But we should not confuse category according to David Buehler, because natural history has its own logic, and the cultural historians like me have very little to contribute to that conversation. However, as we have discussed it in the previous episode, there are a lot of assumptions here about the identification of culture and truly like to what extent the symbolic realm created through cultural resources participated in this the human evolution process. Those are open questions, but they don't have a space of discussion in his overarching modeling of natural history or evolutionary history. So that's the first point, evolution as a history, as I understand it. Aran, if you anything you want to add, I'm in all ears.
Yes. So I think the point that I want to add to what you said is, I mean, like I think there are two things that are important for me here in this regard. History and evolution, insofar as a Bueller is interested in them, or interested in one a lot more than and the other, seem to share a similar problem, and I'm not sure, like what Bueller would think about that. And that problem is just the broadly speaking the problem of reconstructing the past, right? So his point is that look, it's impossible for us to really reconstruct the ancestral environment that allegedly our main psychological adaptations were evolved in. And because we cannot do that kind of a reconstruction, that epistemic problem exists, then we shouldn't think about it that way. Like that's an piece of information that is ultimately ends up being guesswork, right? So I think my question, more than like a kind of critical remark, is that if that's the case, what can we say about reconstruction of the past in general, right? Is the reconstruction of the past impossible? Is it something that is, how hard actually it is to reconstruct the past? Because I think like there might be two different things here. That it is hard to reconstruct the past in so far as we want to find the like selective pressures that existed in ancestral environments. Okay, now let's like rephrase that question in a different way, in a more historical, not evolutionary biology kind of a way. Can we reconstruct the ancestral environment of a specific tribe in in Africa based on the relics that we have found, and maybe a kind of whatever tablets or some form of a written communication also, or like just kind of physical anthropology, like going there and just like check out the bones and like any sort of like settlement? Can we reconstruct their lives? Like, what about the Romans? What about like the 20s in Berlin, right? Like, I mean, I'm just not sure if the problem of reconstruction is applicable to any historical analysis in Bueller's account, or there is a particular problem there because we are dealing with selection, right? And here again, this is not so much of a criticism of Bueller. I'm just like interested to see like what is the difference between reconstruction of the past insofar as finding adaptive problems in the evolutionary biology sense of the word goes, versus like reconstructing the past insofar as like economic problems of Germany, Weimar Republic in the 20s go, right? Um, and what is the relationship between these two things? Given all the points about the arms race of adaptation and this kind of like psychological, social, like very much natural, ultimately um, naturally relevant selection pressures on humanity, right? If we take Bueller seriously, in other words, reconstruction and like basically endorse adapting minds versus adapted minds, human psychology was still in adaptation mode when the 20s in Germany was happening, right? Um, does he think then that is gonna like that analysis of that kind of a specific environment, which like to a degree became a global phenomenon of like Great Depression? Um, is that a pressure then that is like an adaptive pressure? Is that part of the natural history as much as it is part of the cultural history? Like where's the boundary between the two? Because for evolutionary psychologists, the problem is not necessarily there in any sort of a radical way because they're only interested in one specific environment. And if they have the answer to that, they're fine. No one gives a damn about like Germany in the 20s or like Roman Empire. It was too early, too late for the evolutionary psychologists' time frame. But Bueller must care. Where is that care? And I think then
Hmm.
the care goes back to that whole point about determining humanity, because then there are historians, which I'm not, but Trent is, that vehemently disagree about how you have to frame the medieval times, like what layers you need to kind of bring out and what method you should approach and how you can reconstruct. That seems to be very much relevant to the adaptation problem from a very natural side of humanity, right? So I think it's that it is interesting that that is absolutely absent because that seems to be a very much a question of natural selection for someone like Bueller, unless he thinks this is not about natural selection, and then we have to like then go back and say that okay, what is the point about the arms race of adaptation then, right? So when we speak of adaptation, are we still in the realm of evolutionary biology? When we think about history, are we still thinking about natural history? Or now somehow these two are intertwined? No answer is given to that question. I think that's important. Also, this is a much shorter point. I think the point about history is not just a lot of times like the examples that exist in Bueller's work is kind of like snapshots of cultures, right? That like here in this culture there was incest taboo, there was this so and so. This is other culture, incest taboo was so and so. I think another thing that is like kind of important that is absent there is that what a cultural phenomena is and whether it is the same universal or belongs to a cultural universal um, does not we have no guarantee of understanding that from a snapshot of a society, right? So history is essential in understanding whether what we see in this society is actually about incest taboo and it's not about something quite different, right? Or whatever is happening here as a quote unquote a trait is that can be is subsumable under the category of mating and not under the category of friendship or under a category of a different social relations that doesn't exist in like Netherlands. Like it doesn't like there is no guarantee that like all social relations are gonna mean the same thing and have the same function. So like one of the beloved examples for evolutionary psychologists is marriage. But I mean, like marriage. What is marriage? And what kind of a relationship could be subsumable under the category marriage? I don't see a way to answer that question unless there is a not only cultural analysis, but a cultural analysis that is interested in historical analysis, right? I'm saying that because that is not something irrelevant to evolutionary psychologist's project, nor Bueller's project. If you want to say cultural universals exist, or marriage is a cultural universal, you need to cite as much as you cite evolutionary biologists, you need to cite cultural anthropologists and historians that will just look for the specifics. That it's not at all meaningless to think that like two people getting into a ritual and just sleeping with one another later on could be a completely different episode in one culture versus another culture. Maybe for this culture is marriage, for this other culture it's just like some form of a religious act of like sanctifying the land. They're like there is something about that. Like I'm not sure if these are the same. Like if you have a snapshot of a male and female person in a room after a ritualization having a sexual relationship, is that marriage? I'm not saying it's not marriage. I'm just saying I don't know. And I don't think evolutionary psychologists know. And Bueller knows, right? And I think that kind of a lack of acknowledgement is something that is very important, and how this is ultimately intertwined in a way that it is not acknowledged by Bueller either. Um, Now, Trent, do you have anything to add to
Yes,
that, or should I move
very
on?
briefly. I think that's very helpful what you said. The two things I think you mentioned I didn't think of when I tried to connect the evolution and the history. I was focusing only on the historical unit or the logic of constituting time provided by evolutionary biology. But I think you pointed out something really interesting here is the subject matter of analysis that should be historicized, like culture universals, whatever. And in a sense, because Bueller really emphasizes that there's no mating problem, there's only concrete problems faced by a specific population in a specific historical moment. Therefore, marriage or the cooking or the so-called cultural universal must be contextualized in its geographical and temporal locations. And another thing you mentioned, which reminds me, is really missing in his overarching understanding of history of the Homo sapiens, is the concept of technology, because if we when reading Tubi and the Cosmin, it seems like a human brain is like an arsenal of different like toolbox, like psychological mechanisms, concrete psychological mechanisms are the concrete technology to solve specific problems. But of course, they are also externalized technology. Those for Tubi, they could just dismiss because like they have a specific type of dichotomy. And I think David Bueller is precisely trying to challenge that dichotomy. Certain institutions, certain social relationship is very much part of this whole adapting process. The whole part of mind environment and negotiation, but that is not. And technologies, if you were archaeologists would tell you, they have its own logic of evolution. It has its own logic of adaptation. Let's take it like agriculture as an example. If once a certain agricultural technology become established, you often spread across different specific interbreeding human groups and fundamentally change the way a human group consider the concept of resource, and power, and marriage, and their relationship with land, everything. So it's a game changer. But that specific category is not present in his dichotomy between a natural and the cultural history. I think that's really interesting. Of course, that's not the only thing that is missing, but there's just something really struck me when you were giving the example of like Roman Empire and the Weimar Republic. And Tubi could dismiss them, but Bueller couldn't because the adapting process is ongoing.
Yeah, and I think in just one quick thing is that like I'm not sure where adaptation ends for Bueller. I know where adaptation ends for Tubi and Cosmodus. I don't know where it ends, and I'm not saying it should end, but then it just becomes kind of like yeah, it just if adaptation is just like happening right now because of like very specific like internet, internet has happened as a technological phenomenon, and now we're adapting in a very kind of like a basic evolutionary way. Are we? Is it even meaningful to invoke the point about evolutionary biology anymore? Because maybe like adaptation in the evolutionary biology sense is just like selective selection for fitness for a very specific task. Um, but it seems like adaptation for Bueller starts to expand on other things. Adaptation that ultimately leads to that fitness problem suddenly requires you being able to use an ATM machine, right? Like that's if you're not able to deal with the technological advancement around you, you will die, and that's important, right? But then the adaptation kind of goes into like minute psychological um, issues that are historically situated, and then the whole inquiry about like evolutionary psychology turns into like a very different framework that Bueller doesn't seem to be suggesting. So it's unclear to me why not. Um, the second point here, like all the points that we're going to hear from now on, they're all kind of interconnected. And I mean, it's just a conceptual, maybe ambiguity that is not addressed, that ultimately is about this kind of a nature culture distinction, this realm of biology and this realm of non biology. That again for like evolutionary psychologists or even a more transparent conceptually coherent reductionists, some of these reductions are more meaningful, but for Bueller is not. So if evolutionary psychologists like do some level of like you know uh, reductionism that is at the level of biology, then we can just say that hey, that's fine, that's that is permitted. But wait, but what they're doing. But some of these moves are unexpected from Bueller as a critique of that paradigm. And one of the most bothering things is kind of the logic of boundary making, and how these logical boundary making kind of subtly, not so subtly, transfer into spaces of humanity, right? A group of human beings. What is that? A population, a settlement, a society. These are not the same concepts, right? It seems like that from an evolutionary perspective, something that matters for Bueller is population. And population is like a reproductively isolated group of people. Okay. First of all, I'm not even sure what that means in the sense that are like people who are in the Amazon with no contact with any other human beings reproductively isolated in a way that we can say that they are another species. That seems odd. So it seems that it's not just about isolation, it's about the possibility of breeding. right? Maybe the possibility that we have no reason to think that we cannot have babies with like the secluded tribes in the Amazons. Maybe that's the thing. So possibility of interbreeding is a definition of population. But then what is a society? And I think that's just not a random like point because again, I think a more radical and in some ways interesting critique um, would say that we use the concept of society, that's just like a random construct that like doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter. Let's just go home. Like this is not a category we need to stick with. But if you're thinking about like so like in this society, incest taboo is so and so, you're already beyond population. You're using a different category for differentiating subparts of humanity. Why? Like what justifies the conceptually coherent, scientifically accurate use of a concept like concept of society? And if you want to get rid of the concept of human societies, how do you define the boundaries between different populations of humanity? Should we think about us as one population? Then our concepts of universals are going to be very awkward, right? Because there's what like the concept of like Argentinians and like Algerians, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There's no real boundary. They're just like part of a possibly interbreeding genealogical nexus. There's one population. Then what is that further differentiation? How is that granted? Um, I mean, it seems like that with other species, we don't necessarily add these other categories, right? We might say that this species of a grackle that exists in Austin, Texas, um, either there are the same species in other places or they're not. I mean, we start talking about the specific maybe behavior of grackles in Austin versus grackles in other places, which might kind of you know be start to be close to this idea of invoking the concept of society, but it's not as strong. Also, there's something also very weird, which is like within a human population that is very much possibly could interbreed, there are societies within those that we talk about, right? The monks that are in the boundaries of whatever Holy Roman Empire, and they are just hanging out. Are they their own population? Are they their own society? And all of these matters because ultimately we want to say what is human nature, or does it exist, or it doesn't exist, or like how much of these differences matter, and how much of these differences are superficial variations, and how much of these differences are anything relevant to the biological science, and how much of these differences are going to tell us about universals in humanity, right? Without any logic of differentiation of like now it's time to use the concept of society, I think there will be an unjustified jump from population to society anytime we can use of that, make use of that. And I don't find that convincing. Tell me what you mean by society versus population, and why you decided suddenly it's time to think of society as a sui generis important category that doesn't seem to fit the other types of concepts that are used in evolutionary biology. What is the logic of the jump? Trent.
Yes, I very much agree with you. I think at the core of it is the problem with the universal individual. Like the Vibula needs both, but he's both are used in very inconsistent ways. The one he's identifying human population is using evolutionary definition, genealogical nexus. But when he's talking about a society or settlement, it's more like cultural anthropological, sharing similar cultural sensitivities or technology or information. Give one example from like cultural anthropology, like the founding father of modern anthropology, Branislaw Malinowski did field work at Papua New Guinea. They're like archipelago, different islands. They have very, very different social structures. Some are matrilineal, some are patrilineal, some like are just like all the cultural universals that people try to identify. It's hard even to discern certain cultural universal among them. Yet they are all engaged in the same gift exchange ritual, which would fundamentally determine the status and hierarchy within each group. But yet they did not intermarry. So like for David Buehler, then they will constitute distinct populations, yet they share the same social space or environment that they co-create. So they belong to the same society to a certain extent, but they are distinct populations. How do you correlate that? And I think there's a very naive one-to-one correspondence in the way he uses literature on cultural universals and bring it directly to his like Darwinian evolution based compartmentalization of human groups, of namely population and society. And if you ask a sociologist like Nicholas Luhmann, it's pointless to use a plural for a concept like society. There's only one human society, full stop, because we all have that potential for connection and communication. It's just like in this sense, it's also very similar to the concept of species, because even though we're reproductively isolated, we have the potential of interbreed. So how does one get from that collective universal category of a human being or society to distinct settlement, population, cultures, or social units is something completely missing in his analysis. Yet his overarching theory of the concept of adapting at the granular, fine grain adapting environment absolutely requires him to provide a convincing theory of correlating that overarching universal with concrete specifics. Yes.
Yes, and I think that in this problem of like use of concepts that are maybe belong to the other discipline and just kind of provoking them and needing them without really kind of telling us anything about, continues in the concept of culture, right? And I think some of these problems that you mentioned exist there, but there is also the problem of something probably more specific about culture. Trent, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I'll start and you add on. We've already touched on this. Culture is treated in such an ambiguous sense. On one hand, there are like cultural universals that's very distinct problems and not historical. It's just it's almost treated as like natural kind. There's the incest taboo. There's like a cooking problem. You can test it in all different areas and the time periods, which would potentially correlate with the psychological universals, but not in a very strict causal sense, according to David Buehler. But on the other hand, it seems like he's been treating culture as a specific type of add-ons or content that got associated and transmitted through the reproductive process of any specific human population. Say that because he treats things ahistorically. There's a group on a specific island. They've been living there for 1,000 years, and we have like material evidence suggested it was patrilineal 1,000 years ago, and we have ethnography on the other hand saying it's patrilineal. So okay, this specific culture, concrete culture, contributes to our understanding of the cultural universals by providing one essentialized example of a patrilineal society. And that Particularly, so that trait is transmitted through the reproduction of that specific population. Okay, in that sense, the cultural information content is transmitted down across time through biological reproduction, and it's not having its own unit and own self-organizing principle. It does not spread outside that reproductive process independently. However, that's precisely not how culture works. They're like spread of language, spread of technology, spread of agriculture. You don't necessarily need genetic interaction to have the spread of culture. And so that's one side. The other, if you take that to the extreme, okay, we agree with the David Builder. Culture, at the end, we're analyzing content. It doesn't really have, so it's not really an actor in evolution, right? And by in so doing, we're treating it essentially as information passed down through a certain network and or self-referential system. And in this case, biological reproduction, genes, whatever. But that why do we stop there? We should go even further and see how this information system correlated with other non-cultural information system in the sense like if ecological feature if one ecosystem has one information mechanism feedback loop to maintain certain balance in I don't know pH level like the composition of the air in the atmosphere, that's also information system. Why don't we incorporate that into our analysis of the reproduction of human beings? Because human beings need an equilibrium in that ecosystem to be successfully adaptive and reproduce. So I think on both hand, his concept of culture is problematic. Is it will be too reductionist for cultural anthropologists in the sense of reducing it to information or denying its own kind of self-organizing principle. But also for hardcore environmental determinists, it's not like not really properly situated in the sense that he still gives culture a separate unit from other information existing for like the mind, say. Yeah, that's my take on this point.
Yeah. So I think kind of expanding on that point about like I think that there is I mean this is a problem that is not just about I think there are problems that are kind of just concerned with his conception of concept or his lack of elaboration of that concept. But I think like this whole like informational domains, also like the informational domain of culture, informational domain of genes, right? These two as like different, the difference being the different mechanisms of like transmission. I think first of all, on the one hand, it seems like that for Bueller, culture is fully involved in the arms race of adaptations. Okay, so the informational space that culture provides is very much directing and influencing psychological adaptations that apparently are the objects of evolutionary biology as well. What I'm not sure here is that remember the very first episode of like us talking about Bueller's book, that evolution is interested in genotypic change, right? Information at the level of genes, right? Remember the point that about the phenotypic change, that like if you no matter how if you go like, to the gym every day, that doesn't make your child a bodybuilder from the very beginning. Like it's not that's not the point. Like you changing your muscles doesn't change the muscles of your child. Fair enough. But if I am like in its information system in which like access to resources are more readily available to people who do bodybuilding, and there is some sort of a cult of appreciation of some Greco-Roman exemplar of male beauty, then there's an informational system that is going to be transferred within that culture, and it's definitely going to have effect on like psychologies from like Bueller's perspective, psychologies of the people involved in the process, but maybe there is no genetic component of this, then even becomes far more odd that cultural history becomes absent in Bueller's account. Because, like, evolutionary biologists could say that when we talk about adaptations, we're strictly talking about adaptations that are genetically coded. The other meaning of adaptation that is cultural is ultimately subsumable to that genetic expression. You see, like for evolutionary psychologists, adaptation is an evolutionary act, and evolution is about genetics. And the rest of our psychological behavior is reducible to that genetic structure. Bueller wants to say that the only thing that is genetically determined is neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity ultimately means that the sculpting of our brain is about an interaction between the pre-existing structure of the brain and the environment. And the final form of the brain is not a mere given based on that genetic predetermination. Okay, so in that sense, psychological adaptation is not reducible to some genetically programmed given in our brain. It's about some other space, right? And that space itself cannot be just like thrown as, oh, that's just culture. Like, first of all, there are all sorts of other layers that are, as Trent mentioned, the issue of ecology that is going to be actually our last point. Like, what is ecology in that calculation? But also, like, then you need to kind of tell us a little bit more about this culture and its relationship to the whole story of adaptation in a biological sense. Also, I think it's important to see that if we understand culture as a system of information and we understand genetics as a system of information, and if we think that each system is creating constraints for any individual human being that kind of pops into the world, what kind of constraints each system are creating? Meaning that if we want to kind of get away from some form of maximum plasticity, that I don't think, definitely not evolution psychologists, but I don't think either Bueller endorse, where is that talk about constraint and interaction between these two realms? And last point is that other than the problem of like unit of cultures, or maybe related to the problem of the unit of cultures, I'm not sure that if we understand cultures as a systems of information transmission, why shouldn't we kind of collapse this conversation to what Trent mentioned about Luhmann and society? Because it seems like that, first of all, the potential of transmission of information through cultural means may be a global phenomenon. In some cases are. Definitely there are some cultures that are radically different in other measures, like, Iran, US, and China, that are they have their transmit stuff to each other culturally, as through culturally information through cultural means, not genetic means. But what does that mean that we are talking about the same culture? Like if there is any interaction and the passing of information, we're talking about one single culture? That seems very odd. Is it about like the level of information transmission that determines this is the unit of this culture? Well, like I don't know how to make the boundaries. Like it seems like that it's rather arbitrary based on the resources Bueller provides to create those boundaries. We might need other kind of additions to the idea of information transmission through communication instead of genetics to be able to think about the boundaries between different human populations. Otherwise, this just becomes a very important concept that is merely borrowed and vaguely used, and that's not satisfactory. Ultimately, as Trent mentioned, also this the problem of the environment and the lack of ecological logic is very important here. I think this shows itself in all the accounts that we have talked about. That is very like isolationist. That it seems like that they are like, okay, Homo sapiens are this, and I'm not gonna mention anything about the bacteria in our gut, or I'm not saying anything about like the ecology that may shape human beings that has nothing to do with mere genetics of my existence, right? So you can again go to the path of evolution psychologists, that ecology is ultimately subsumes under genetics, meaning that I have a genetical structure. That genetical structure makes me sensitive to some layers of the environment versus the others. The environment doesn't do anything to me other than triggering my developmental programs or giving cues for my developmental programs. So there is no meaning to talk about ecology, because whatever my ecology is, ultimately is just about like triggering this developmental program or another developmental program, right? If Bueller thinks that that is refuted based on the point about neural plasticity, then ecology is very important in understanding the determination of humanity. It's not only important in that way, but it is important in the sense that like same like genetic structure could lead to very different type of humanity based on that ecological constraint. And here I think what I want to say is might seem counterintuitive in the sense that I think when people talk about different environments, different ecologies, different cultures, they want to say that, oh, more diversity. I want to suggest something that could be the exact opposite of that. I think consideration for something like ecology could actually give us clues about determination and limitation and constraint as opposed to openness, right? In other words, maybe in terms of when we look at like the kind of genetic configuration of humanity, or the biological nexus of Homo sapiens, we don't see the determination in the way that evolutionary psychologists want to say, right? But maybe within that kind of a genetic diversity, limited genetic diversity, and kind of diversity of adaptation in terms of psychological behavior, let's say from some form of frequency dependent selection, ecology may create a specific type of determinism of what we are that is not discussed. Maybe it provides a specific type of openness that hasn't been discussed. The important point is that it is not discussed, right? It is not clear that the symbiotic relationship of humanity with other entities, how could it really you know open up the door about limitations and openness of humanity. And by limitation and openness, I mean the basic determination of humanity, because like the same genetic kind of a configuration in a human being, if it's thrown into a prison cell, right, that environment matters in what it ends up being. It creates certain limitations, certain openings, right? This genetic structure thrown in a different type of a space will have a different limitation and different openness. If there is neural plasticity, if we endorse that point that Buehler mentions about neural plasticity, the issue is not just about the general point about, the adaptive, the arms race of adaptation in the psychological sense that has a very ambiguous relationship with the genetic change in the biological level of humanity, but also it's about logic, and I want to emphasize on that because from the very beginning of these conversations in our first critical remarks that were about evolution psychology, the question of causality came in, right? And there are a lot of discussions about like what type of causal system is appropriate in understanding different phenomena. Of course, there is always a reductionist option that the causal systems that are the causal logic that is applicable to physical entities and like solar systems, the same causal modeling is necessary and sufficient for explaining biological entities. If we are Bueller, it seems to suggest there is some sort of a sui generis analysis at the biological level. Otherwise, he would have written a far more reductionistic book. Then, what logic of causality we need to use to understand biological entities? And one important thing that is very, very much absent is any mention of any form of ecological logic. That there are a good number of ecologists that there might be very much on top of our list to deal with that think about very different kind of causal mapping of relations that only once that is done we can really talk about determination of a species, right? So if human nature is ultimately about determining what it means to be a human being in a more relaxed, loose way of the word, and not just like essence in a very kind of pre-Darwinian sense, then what happened to ecology? Trent?
Yes, a lot of really interesting ideas in what you just said. I think I want to add on to that by emphasizing um, it remains unclear to me how David Buehler tests the limit of, say, neuroplasticity or adaptive plasticity. Because it cannot just be strictly genetically determined in the sense that a scouting process entails. And if you take our brain or mind as the unit of analysis, what is its environment? Not just the things outside human body, but also things within human body. And that's, I think, what you mentioned or emphasized, the logic of ecologic self-organization really comes to be, because the human body definitely has its own logic for self-organizing. And what's its relationship with the intersubject or beyond, like the whole ecosystems to the self-organizing process? I think those are really important questions if we want to take his idea of neuroplasticity and depth plasticity seriously. Yes.
Yes, and I think the language of organization I think is particularly important because it's the logic of organization and entropy, right? And
Mm.
how like that's what I meant by limitation and openness in a way, right? Like there is organization is about kind of curbing entropy. That there are certain things that will are not possible, or their possibility destroys a system, right? If you don't have a heart, the organization is destroyed. It is a necessity limit on me that I must have a heart for me to be what I am, right? That creates some sort of an internal limitation on like how I can kind of have an organization. This also means that this specific anatomy has certain type of an openness, that openness is intertwined with that organization, right? And I think this kind of logic of organization, once we save the concept of environment from evolutionary psychologists' viewpoint of it, which, by the way, I think there is a legitimate engagement that we're required to do at some point with the more transparent, conceptually sound reductionists that would say that get rid of all of these concepts. There's just reductionism, right? But insofar as we don't take that route and say that evolutionary psychologists are wrong about environment, we need to notice what we have unleashed. What we have unleashed is not just, oh, we found another kind of like simple line from human being to environment. That doesn't make any sense from an ecological perspective, because environment is not just a thing that is there, we're in it. We are constituting and constituted by the environment. We are part of the environment and we are constituted by it. Reminds me of that thing about Hegel, right? Constitution and determination, that like you're both kind of defined by the other and the other is defined by you, and both of these variations are going to be there. That sounds like the basics of the logic of determination, logic of organization at the ecological level. And I think that's the absence of understanding that these logics of relations are very much relevant to the question of human nature. It creates a major flaw in Bueller's argument. That's it for me. Trent?
Nothing to add. We talked really enough about this book, and I think we should just thank our listeners for their attention. So, dear listeners, thank you for your support and engagement. We look forward to your feedback, everything, ideas, suggestions, the criticism, leave the comment. And after a discussion between Aran and I, so that we will update you on the new project. I think we'll be on the line for what Aran just said, concept of environment, the self-organizing principle. I will take it from there. All right. So thanks for listening. See you next time.